The year was 1879, and in the Montana Territory, a man could measure his worth in three
The
ways:
train's leaving.
by the
You must
acres
go.
he owned,
I know. I'll
by
write
the
as soon as
cattle
I
he
can.
raised,
Be safe.
and by his ability to endure silence. Theron Ash had mastered all three. At 42 years old, he stood alone on 240 acres of grassland that stretched toward mountains so distant they looked like smoke against the winter sky. His hands were calloused from 16 years of ranch work, his shoulders broad from splitting enough firewood to outlast the brutal Montana winters, and his heart, if anyone had bothered to ask about it, had grown as quiet as the empty rooms of his cabin. 3 years had passed since the diphtheria took them. 3 years since he had returned from a hunting trip to find his wife Anna cold in their bed, their 8-year-old son Lucas curled beside her as if sleeping. The doctor said they had been gone for 3 days before Theron found them. 3 days during which Theron had been tracking elk in the high country, believing his family was safe, believing the world made sense, believing that a man who worked hard and loved well would be protected from the kind of loss that hollows out your chest and leaves you walking through life like a ghost. He had not spoken to God since that day, had not spoken much to anyone, truth be told. The ranch demanded conversation only with animals and weather, and Theron found both to be more honest company than most men. On this particular November morning, the frost clung to everything like a promise of the hard months ahead. Theron rose at 4:30 as he had every morning for the past 3 years and dressed in the dark. His cabin consisted of 4 rooms, a main room with a stone fireplace and a rough-hewn table, a bedroom he no longer used for sleeping, choosing instead the chair by the fire, a small room that had been Lucas's, and a pantry that stayed cold enough to preserve meat through autumn. 20 yards from the main cabin stood a smaller structure, the one he had built for Anna when they first married before Lucas came, when they thought they might fill the place with children and laughter and all the noise that makes a house feel like more than just walls and a roof. He had not opened the door to that cabin in 3 years, had locked it the day after he buried them, and the key hung on a nail by his bedpost untouched. Theron pulled on his work shirt, his wool vest, his coat that smelled of smoke and pine, and the particular scent of a man who lives alone. He moved through the morning routine with the efficiency of someone who has performed the same tasks 1,000 times, stoke the fire-boil coffee in a dented pot, fry 2 eggs in bacon. Grease eat standing up because sitting at the table alone felt like admitting something he was not ready to admit. Outside, the cattle were stirring in the near pasture. 82 head of mixed stock, mostly Herefords, with a few stubborn longhorns he had traded for years ago. The count had been 65 when Anna was alive. He had increased the herd by working harder, longer, pushing himself through grief the way some men push through whiskey, except his addiction was labor and his hangover was exhaustion so deep he could sleep without dreaming. But a man can only work so much alone. This was the truth that had been growing in Theron's mind like ice forming on a pond, slow and undeniable. The ranch needed 2 people, needed someone to manage the house while he managed the land, needed someone to can the vegetables and salt the meat and keep the chickens from being taken by foxes and handle the 100 small tasks that make the difference between surviving winter and not. Last spring he had tried hiring help. A drifter named Coleman had lasted 2 weeks before leaving in the night with Theron's second-best rifle and $30 from the cash box. In summer, a Crow Indian called Joseph had worked for a month, good with horses, better with silence, but he had family up north, and when they called for him, he went. Theron did not begrudge him. Family, he had learned, was the one thing worth abandoning everything else for, even if you learned that lesson too late. The problem was simple mathematics. Hired help cost $30 a month, and that was for someone willing to work hard and not steal. $360 a year, and the ranch only cleared about $400 in profit after expenses. $40 was not enough margin for a bad winter or a sick herd or any of the 100 disasters that could befall a man trying to make a living from land and animals. The solution had come to him one evening in late October when Garrick Hale, his nearest neighbor 8 miles to the east, had stopped by with a bottle of whiskey and the kind of conversation that happens between men who have known each other long enough to skip the pleasantries. "You need a wife," Garrick had said, pouring 2 glasses. Theron had stared at him like he had suggested setting the barn on fire. "Hear me out," Garrick continued. He was 55, weathered as old leather, a man who had buried his first wife to cholera 15 years ago, and had the good fortune to find Margaret 5 years later. Not for love. Hell, I know better than to talk to you about that. But for practicality. A wife cost you nothing but food she'd help grow anyway. She'd manage the house, do the sewing and cooking help with harvest. And if you're lucky, she'd be good company. If you're unlucky, well, at least your shirts would be clean. Theron had drunk his whiskey and said nothing. "There's agencies," Garrick pressed on, "back east full of women who'd come out here for a chance at something better than what they got. Widows mostly. Women who've already buried one husband and aren't looking for romance the second time around. Just security. Honest work. A roof that doesn't leak." "I don't have anything to offer a woman," Theron said finally. "You have land. That's more than most men can say. And you're not mean, which is more than most women can hope for." The conversation had ended there, but the idea had taken root, not because Theron wanted companionship. He had made his peace with loneliness. But because the ranch was dying slowly under the weight of too much work for one man, and he had promised Anna in those last coherent moments before the fever took her completely that he would not let the land go, that he would hold it for Lucas's children, even though there would be no Lucas's children now, because a promise made to the dying is the one kind of promise that cannot be broken. So 3 weeks ago, on a cold morning much like this one, Theron had ridden into Virginia City and found the office of the Montana Matrimonial Agency, a small room above a dry goods store run by a woman named Mrs. Phelps, who had the brisk efficiency of someone who had arranged hundreds of marriages and had stopped being sentimental about it decades ago. "I need someone practical," Theron had said, standing in her cramped office hat in his hands. "Someone who can work. I'm not offering romance, just partnership." Mrs. Phelps had looked at him over her spectacles, taking in his weathered face, his work-worn hands, the way he stood like a man who had forgotten how to be comfortable indoors. "I have 3 possibles," she said, pulling files from a drawer. "First is a widow from Ohio, age 36, 5 children." "No children," Theron said quickly. The thought of children in the cabin of small voices where Lucas's voice should be was unbearable. "Second is a woman from Philadelphia, 24, educated, looking for adventure in the West." "No adventures," Theron said, "just work." Mrs. Phelps pulled out the 3rd file. "Iris Caldwell, 29, from Boston. Widowed 2 years, no children. Her letter indicates she's in difficult financial circumstances and needs practical arrangement, not romantic illusions. She can read, write, and cipher, knows basic household management, states clearly she understands Western life is hard, and is willing to learn ranching skills." She passed him a small photograph, the kind taken in a studio with careful lighting. The woman looking back at him had dark hair pulled severely back, a straight nose, and eyes that held the particular exhaustion of someone who has learned that life does not deliver what it promises. She was not smiling. Theron appreciated that. Smiling in a photograph meant lying to the camera. "She'll do," he said. "Don't you want to know why she needs to come west so desperately?" "No," Theron said. "Everyone who comes to Montana is running from something. I don't need to know what. I just need to know she'll work and won't complain." Mrs. Phelps had arranged everything. The letters, the train ticket, the marriage certificate that would be filed once Iris arrived, and agreed to the arrangement. The cost was $50, which was a significant sum, but still cheaper than 4 months of hired help. In the letter he had dictated to Mrs. Phelps to send to Iris Theron had been direct. "I am offering room board and $15 per month in exchange for household management and ranch assistance. I am 42 years old, a widower owner of a cattle ranch in Montana Territory. I expect hard work and honesty. In return, I will provide safety and stability. This is a business arrangement. I am not promising love or even affection, only fair treatment and respect." Her response had come 3 weeks later, written in a careful hand. "I accept your terms. I understand this is a practical arrangement. I am capable of hard work and do not expect romance. I have debts that must be repaid, and your offer of $15 monthly will allow me to do so over time. I can be ready to travel within 2 weeks of receiving your confirmation." There had been something in that letter, in the straightforward acknowledgment of debt and need, that had convinced Theron she would not be the type to expect things he could not give. Debt was honest. Debt meant she understood the world worked on accounts payable and accounts owed, not on feelings and promises. He had sent the confirmation immediately. And now, on this November morning, with frost turning the world silver, and his breath visible in the pre-dawn air, Theron was preparing for her arrival. The train would reach Virginia City at 2 in the afternoon. It was a 3-hour ride from the ranch to town, which meant he needed to leave by 10:30 to arrive in time. He spent the morning hours working with the kind of focused intensity that keeps a man from thinking too much. Mucked out the barn, checked the fence line along the eastern pasture, where the creek had undermined some posts during autumn floods, split enough firewood to last a week. The physical labor was familiar, comforting in its demands. Lift, swing, split, stack, repeat. The wood yielded under the axe with satisfying cracks, and the pile grew, and for those hours Theron did not have to think about the fact that by nightfall there would be another person in his house, another voice breaking 3 years of silence. At 10, he washed at the pump, the water so cold it made his hands ache. He changed into his better shirt, the one without patches, and his newer vest. He saddled Gunner, his bay gelding, steady and reliable as winter. Then he stood for a moment in the cabin looking around at the space that had been only his for so long. The main room was clean because Theron kept it that way. Not particular clean, but functional. No dust thick enough to write your name in. No dishes left unwashed. The kind of clean that comes from a man who follows the same routine every day and puts things back where they belong, because there is no one else to blame if something goes missing. But he could see it now through a stranger's eyes, see how spare it was, how the walls were bare except for a single shelf holding his father's Bible and a book on cattle diseases, how the table had only one chair pulled up to it, the other 3 pushed against the wall because he never sat anywhere but the same spot, how the fireplace had stones missing where Anna had meant to fit decorative river rocks but never got around to it, how everything in the room spoke of a man living but not quite alive. He considered briefly putting out the photograph of Anna and Lucas that he kept in his bedroom drawer, decided against it. Iris was not coming here to compete with ghosts. She was coming to work. At 10:30 he mounted Gunner and rode toward Virginia City. The trail wound through grassland turning brown with coming winter, past stands of cottonwood already bare, their white branches like bones against the gray sky. The mountains to the west wore their first snow, just a dusting on the highest peaks, a reminder that winter here was not a season but a test of whether you had prepared well enough to survive. Theron had always passed that test. Even the first winter after Anna and Lucas died, when he had been so lost in grief he could barely remember to eat. Some animal part of his brain had kept him cutting wood, keeping the fire going, feeding the stock. Survival, he had learned, was not about wanting to live. It was about the habits you built when living had a purpose, habits so ingrained they carried you through the times when purpose disappeared. He reached Virginia City at 1:30, the town bustling with the particular energy of a place that existed because gold had been found nearby 30 years ago and had stayed because enough people had decided to build lives here even after the easy gold ran out. The main street was rutted mud frozen into peaks and valleys. Buildings leaned against each other like drunks walking home. A few wagons were tied outside the mercantile horses, standing patient in the cold, their breath steaming in the winter air. The train station was at the east end of town, a modest building with a covered platform and a ticket window that was only staffed when trains were due. Theron tied Gunner to the hitching post and checked his pocket watch. 1:45. The 2 o'clock train from the east was usually on time, usually but not always. He had heard stories of trains delayed days by early blizzards or track washouts or any of the 100 problems that came from trying to run machinery through country that did not particularly want to be civilized. He stood on the platform and waited. Other people gathered as the time approached, a family with 4 children, loud and restless, an older man in a suit that had seen better days, 2 cowboys younger than Theron talking about work they hoped to find at the mines, a woman with gray hair and a face like a hawk watching everything with sharp eyes. At 2:15 the train whistle sounded in the distance, and Theron felt something he had not expected: nervousness, not about Iris Caldwell herself, but about the change she represented. For 3 years his life had been still as a held breath. Now that breath was going to release, and he did not know what would come after. The train pulled into the station with great hissing sighs of steam, the engine massive and black and smelling of coal and hot metal. Passengers began disembarking. The family rushed forward, embracing someone who stepped down from the third car. The old man in the suit waited, but no one came for him, and eventually he walked away, shoulders bent. Theron held the paper. Mrs. Phelps had given him with a description: dark hair, medium height, will be carrying a brown carpet bag and wearing a blue traveling dress. And then she was there, stepping down from the train car with careful precision, one hand holding her skirt to keep it from dragging, the other gripping the handle of a carpet bag that had been repaired in several places with darker thread. She wore a blue dress as described, but it was not the fashionable blue of a woman with money. It was the faded blue of fabric that had been worn and washed and worn again, let out and taken in, until the seams were marks of a garment's history. But she stood straight, chin up, looking at the town, at the mountains beyond, at the rough men and rougher buildings, with an expression that was not fear and not excitement, but something harder to name. Assessment, maybe, or determination. Theron stepped forward, removing his hat. Mrs. Caldwell. She turned to look at him, and up close he could see the photograph had not lied. Dark hair pinned back tightly. A face that was handsome rather than pretty, with strong features and that same exhaustion in her eyes that he had noticed in the photograph. But also something the photograph had not captured: a scar, faint, but visible, running along her right jawline from ear to chin. Not disfiguring, but present. The kind of scar that came from something sharp or hot, or both. Mr. Ash, her voice was steady, Eastern accent clear but not overly refined, the voice of someone educated but not wealthy. Yes, ma'am. He gestured toward where Gunner waited. The ranch is 3 hours from here. We should start now to get back before dark. She looked at the horse, then at him, and for a moment he wondered if she had expected a wagon something more comfortable for a woman unused to Western travel. But she only nodded. I can ride if there's a horse for me, or I can ride behind you if there isn't. Behind me, he said. I didn't know if you could ride, and I only brought 1 horse. Next time we come to town, we'll get you a mount of your own. That's practical, she said, and picked up her carpet bag. As Theron helped her onto Gunner, his hands on her waist to lift her into position behind the saddle, he noticed 3 things. First, she was lighter than he expected, as if she had not been eating enough. Second, she did not flinch or pull away from his touch, but she did not relax into it either. She tolerated it as a necessary interaction. Third, through the fabric of her dress he could feel something rigid along her right forearm. Another injury, perhaps, or something she wore for support. She settled behind him, her carpet bag secured to the saddle, and after a moment's hesitation, placed her hands lightly on his waist, not clinging, just steadying herself. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes." He turned Gunner toward home, and they rode out of Virginia City in silence. The first hour passed without conversation. Theron was not a talker by nature, and Iris Caldwell seemed content to watch the landscape unfold around them. The grasslands, the distant mountains, the big sky that stretched overhead, with the kind of vastness that made Eastern people uncomfortable because there was nowhere to hide from your own smallness. As they crossed a ridge that gave a view of the valley below, Iris spoke for the first time. "It's beautiful. It's hard," Theron said. "Things can be both." He had no answer to that, so he said nothing. Another half hour passed. The sun was lowering, turning the western sky orange and gold. Theron felt the temperature beginning to drop the cold that came as soon as the sun lost its strength this time of year. Behind him, he felt Iris shift slightly, pulling her shawl tighter. "Are you warm enough?" he asked. "I will manage." "That's not what I asked." A pause. Then, "I'm cold, but I've been colder." He almost asked what she meant by that, what circumstances had led her to be colder than a November evening in Montana Territory. But asking would invite her to ask questions in return, and he was not ready for that kind of exchange. So instead he said, "Another hour, and we'll be home. There's a good fire and hot coffee. Thank you." When they finally reached the ranch, the sun had set, and the first stars were appearing in a sky going from blue to black. Theron had left a lamp burning in the cabin window, something he never did when he was alone, because it wasted oil. But tonight it seemed important that the place looked like somewhere a person might want to arrive. He helped Iris down from the horse. She stood for a moment swaying slightly stiff from 3 hours of riding after what must have been days on the train. But she steadied herself and picked up her carpetbag. "I'll show you inside," Theron said. "Then I need to see to the horse and check the stock. There's bread and cheese in the pantry if you're hungry. Coffee's still warm on the stove." He led her into the cabin, into the main room where the fire was burning low. She stood just inside the door, taking it in. The spare furniture, the clean but worn floors, the sense of a space occupied but not truly inhabited. "There are 4 rooms," Theron said, moving to light another lamp. "This is the main room. Kitchen area is through there, though it's really just a stove and a counter. Pantry keeps cool year-round. That door leads to the bedroom I use. That one there." He gestured to Lucas's old room. "That's yours." He opened the door to show her. A small room, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. A narrow bed with a quilt Anna had made years ago. A chest of drawers. A small window facing east. A hook on the wall for hanging clothes, nothing else. "It's not much," he said. "It's a room of my own," Iris replied. "That's more than I've had in 2 years. She set her carpetbag on the bed and turned to face him. In the lamplight, her face was shadowed hard to read. "Mr. Ashe, before you go see to your horse, I need to make certain we understand each other." "All right." "I read your letter many times. You stated this is a business arrangement. Room board and $15 monthly in exchange for household work and ranch assistance. You stated you are not promising love or affection, only fair treatment and respect." "That's right. I want to be clear about my circumstances so there are no misunderstandings later. I am not here seeking a husband in the romantic sense. I am here because I owe $670 to a creditor in Boston. My husband died 2 years ago and left me with his gambling debts. I have been working to pay them, but I could only earn $10 monthly at best. At that rate, I would be paying for 6 more years, and the creditor is not patient. Your offer of $15 monthly means I can clear my debt in 45 months. 3 years and 9 months. That is my goal. After that, if you wish me to stay, we can negotiate new terms. If you wish me to leave, I will have the means to do so. Do you accept these terms?" Theron looked at her, this woman who had just traveled halfway across a continent to live with a stranger because mathematics said it was her best option. There was no pleading in her voice. No manipulation, just fact laid out cleanly the way a man might explain the boundaries of his property or the terms of a cattle sale. "I accept," he said. "But if you're paying $15 a month toward a debt of $670, You need 45 months, but that means you'll need $675 total. You'll be $5 over. For the first time, something that might have been a smile touched her face. Then I will consider that $5 payment for your tolerance of my company. Fair enough. He moved toward the door, then paused. Mrs. Caldwell, I need to tell you something as well. I was married before. My wife, Anna, and my son, Lucas, died 3 years ago. Diphtheria. I'm not looking to replace them. I don't talk about them much. But I want you to know they existed, and that they're the reason I don't sit at the head of the table and why there's a locked cabin out back that I don't go into. You don't need to understand it. Just know it's there. She nodded slowly. Thank you for telling me. And Mr. Ash, if we are to be business partners for the next 45 months, perhaps you should call me Iris. Mrs. Caldwell is the name of a woman who no longer exists. Then call me Theron. Mr. Ash is what people call me when they want something. Theron, she repeated, testing the name. It's unusual. It's Greek, means hunter. My mother had pretensions. And did you become a hunter? Of a sort, he said. I hunt what needs to be hunted, mostly peace and quiet. This time she definitely smiled just a little. Then I will try not to disturb your quarry. He left her, then going out into the November cold to unsaddle Gunner and check that the cattle had water and the chickens were secured against foxes. The routine tasks steadied him. By the time he returned to the cabin 40 minutes later, Iris had unpacked her few belongings, hung her spare dress on the hook in her room, and was standing at the stove heating coffee. She had also done something else. On the table she had placed 2 cups, 2 plates, the bread, the cheese, and the butter crock. She had pulled out 2 chairs, one at each end of the table, not side by side, but not so far apart as to make conversation impossible. I thought we should eat, she said. It's been a long day for both of us. Theron almost said he usually ate standing up or not at all, almost said he was not hungry. But something about the deliberate way she had set the table, the care she had taken to make it look like 2 people might sit down together and share a meal, stopped him. He hung his coat on the peg by the door and sat down in the chair she had pulled out. She sat at the other end. They ate bread and cheese and drank coffee that had been sitting on the stove so long it was bitter and thick. Neither of them seemed to mind. After several minutes of silence, Iris said, Tell me about the work. What will my days look like? So Theron told her about the rhythm of ranch life, how winter was slower than other seasons, but not easy, how the cattle needed to be checked daily, even in storms, because a cow could get stuck in ice or hurt in a dozen ways and would die if not found, how the chickens needed tending and the eggs needed gathering, how there was always wood to split and meals to cook and mending to do, and 100 tasks that kept a person moving from dawn until dark. I wake at 4:30, he said. I don't expect you to wake that early, but breakfast should be ready by 5:30. I come in at noon for lunch and dinner should be around 6. I'm not particular about what I eat as long as it's hot and there's enough of it. Can you cook? I can cook, she said. Nothing fancy, but I can make stew and bread and fry meat without burning it. I can also can vegetables if you have a garden come spring. There's a garden plot behind the cabin. Anna used to grow potatoes, carrots, beans, squash. It's gone to weeds now. If you want to work it next year, you can. I'd like that. They talked for another hour, sorting through the practical details of living and working in the same space. What chores she would handle, what chores he would handle. How they would manage the few times they might need to be in town. How she would learn the ranch work she did not yet know. Finally, Iris stood and began clearing the table. You should sleep, she said. You've ridden 6 hours today and you'll be up in a few hours to start again. What about you? I'll sleep soon. I just want to wash these dishes first. Get a sense of where things belong. Theron almost argued, but he was tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. It had been a strange day, a day that marked the end of something and the beginning of something else, and his mind was not quite ready to process what that meant. He stood and moved toward the chair by the fire where he had slept for 3 years. Then he stopped. looked at the closed door to the bedroom he had once shared with Anna, the bedroom he had not slept in since she died. Iris was watching him, hands in the dishwater, but she said nothing. Theron made a decision. He walked to the bedroom, opened the door, and went inside. The bed was made as it had been for 3 years. He had kept the room clean out of habit, but he had not lain in that bed since the night before Anna got sick. Tonight he would. Because Iris Caldwell had traveled 2,000 miles to start a new life in a house where a ghost still lived, and the least he could do was show her that he was capable of moving forward, even if only by feet instead of miles. He lay down on top of the covers, fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. From the main room he could hear the quiet sounds of Iris moving around, the clink of dishes, the soft scrape of a chair being pushed in, the creak of her door opening and closing. And then silence. A different silence than he was used to. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of another person nearby, breathing, existing, sharing the space without demanding anything from it. Theron closed his eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, fell asleep in his own bed. The first morning, Iris woke to darkness so complete she thought for a moment she had gone blind. Then memory returned. Montana. The ranch. A room with one small window facing east where dawn had not yet arrived. She lay still, listening to unfamiliar sounds, wind moving around the cabin's corners, the distant lowing of cattle, and closer, much closer, the sound of someone moving in the main room with the careful quiet of a man trying not to wake another person. She checked the small clock she had brought from Boston. 4:30. Theron had not been exaggerating about his schedule. Iris rose and dressed quickly in the cold. Her breath was visible in the pre-dawn air. She pulled on the warmest dress she owned, a gray wool that had been her Sunday dress once, back when Sunday meant something other than another day to work. Over it she wrapped a shawl. Her hands moved automatically to button and tie movements so practiced she barely needed light. When she emerged from her room, Theron was crouched by the fireplace, building up the fire that had burned low overnight. He glanced up at her entrance, surprise clear on his face despite the dim light. "You don't need to be up this early," he said. "If I'm to make breakfast by 5:30, I need to learn where things are and how your stove works. Every stove has its own temperament." He studied her for a moment, then nodded and returned to the fire. "Coffee's in the tin by the stove. Bacon's in the cold pantry, eggs are in the basket by the door. Bread's in the box on the counter. I take my coffee black and strong. 3 eggs, 4 strips of bacon, 2 pieces of bread. Every morning. Every morning I can get it." Iris moved to the kitchen area, such as it was. A cast-iron stove that had seen decades of use. A counter made from rough planks. A dry sink with a pump that brought water from a well outside. She filled the coffee pot, measured grounds by estimation, and set it on the stove. Found the bacon wrapped in cloth, cold and hard. The eggs were fresh, probably gathered yesterday before Theron left for town. She worked quietly, learning the space by touch and trial. The stove heated unevenly hotter on the left side. The skillets were kept on a shelf underneath the counter. The plates were mismatched but clean, stored in a cupboard that hung slightly crooked, as if someone had started to fix it and never finished. By 5:30 she had breakfast laid out on the table. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint the way Theron seemed to like it. The bacon was crisp, the eggs fried hard because she did not know his preference, and hard eggs were safer than runny ones. The bread was toasted on the stove top. Theron came in from outside smelling of cold air and animals. He washed his hands at the sink, sat down at the table, and ate without speaking. Iris sat at the other end with her own smaller portion, watching him discreetly to gauge his reaction. He ate everything, quickly, efficiently, the way a man eats who has learned food is fuel rather than pleasure. When he finished, he stood, pulled on his coat, and paused at the door. "Thank you for the breakfast." Was it acceptable? It was hot, and there was enough of it, that's all I need. Then he was gone out into the pre-dawn darkness, to do whatever work consumed his mornings. Iris sat alone at the table drinking her coffee and thought about the word acceptable. It was such a low bar, such a modest expectation. She had traveled 2,000 miles to make a man acceptable breakfasts in exchange for $15 a month. But $15 a month was more than acceptable. It was salvation. It was the difference between owing money for 6 more years and owing money for less than 4. It was the difference between being bound to Boston and being free to choose what came next. She finished her coffee and began washing the dishes. The first week established the rhythm that would define December. Theron rose at 4:30 and was gone by 5. Iris made breakfast, cleaned the cabin, tended the chickens, gathered eggs. At noon, Theron returned for lunch, ate quickly, and disappeared again. At 6, he returned for dinner, ate, and then spent an hour by the fire doing paperwork or mending equipment before sleeping. They spoke rarely. Practical exchanges only. The coffee's running low. I'll bring more from town next week. The pump's freezing at night. I'll wrap it tomorrow. Conversations that were transactions, information exchanged like currency. But Iris learned about him anyway, the way you learn about anyone you live with. Learned that he favored his left leg slightly, as if an old injury bothered him in the cold. Learned that he read at night sometimes a book on cattle diseases, though his eyes would drift to the fire more often than the pages. Learned that he never sat at the head of the table, always to the side, leaving the head chair empty. And she learned about the locked cabin. She had noticed it the first morning when she went out to scatter feed for the chickens. 20 yards from the main cabin, a smaller structure with a door secured by a padlock. Curtains in the windows drawn closed. No snow on the steps, which meant Theron had cleared them recently, though he claimed never to go inside. On the third day, when Theron was far out checking the herd, Iris walked to the cabin and peered through a gap in the curtains. She could see very little in the dim interior, but enough. A bed smaller than the one in Theron's room. A chair. What might have been toys on a shelf, she understood then. This had been their space, Anna and Lucas. And Theron had locked it like a tomb, preserving it exactly as it had been the day they died. She did not try to look again. Some griefs were private, and this one was not hers to examine. On the 5th day, something shifted. Iris was in the main room mending one of Theron's shirts where the elbow had worn through. The fire crackled low, and outside snow had begun to fall, the first real snow of the season. Theron came in earlier than usual, just after 5, covered in white. "Storm's coming," he said, brushing snow from his coat. "I brought the near herd closer to the barn. We'll need to check them every few hours tonight if it keeps up like this." "What do you need me to do?" He looked at her, surprised. "You've never worked a storm before." "Then tonight I'll learn." Something changed in his expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening around the eyes. "All right. Dress warm. Layer everything you have. We'll go out after dinner, and then again around midnight, and again at dawn if necessary." That night Iris learned what Montana winter truly meant. The storm came in hard wind, driving snow sideways, temperature dropping so fast she could feel it through her layers of clothing. Theron led her to the barn, where 20 head of cattle stood crowded together, their breath steaming in the cold. "We're counting," Theron said, his voice raised to carry over the wind. "Making sure none of them wandered off or got stuck. If one's missing, we go looking. If one's hurt, we bring it into the barn. Watch where you step. Ice is forming fast." They counted together, Theron pointing out each animal, making sure Iris could distinguish one from another in the darkness and swirling snow. All 20 were accounted for. No injuries visible. "Good," Theron said. "Back inside. We'll check again at midnight." In the cabin, Iris stood by the fire, shaking with cold. Theron poured her coffee, then added a measure of whiskey from a bottle kept on a high shelf. "Drink it," he said. "It'll warm you from the inside." She drank the whiskey, burning down her throat, and felt warmth spread through her chest. "Do you do this every storm?" "Every storm. Some winters that's twice a week. Some winters twice a day for a month straight. Alone? For the last 3 years? Yes. She looked at him. This man who had spent 3 winters walking out into blizzards in the middle of the night to count cattle alone in the darkness and cold with no one to notice if he fell or got lost or simply decided not to come back. "That sounds lonely," she said. "It is what it is." At midnight they went out again. The storm had intensified. Visibility was down to a few feet. They counted the cattle by lantern light, the shadows jumping and shifting in the wind. 19. "Only 19. One's missing." Theron said, his voice tight. "Stay here. I'm going to look." "No." Iris grabbed his arm. "You go alone in this. You might not come back. I'll go with you." "You don't know the land. Then I'll follow your tracks. But I'm not staying here while you walk into a storm alone." He looked at her, and something in his face shifted again. Not gratitude exactly, more like recognition, like he was seeing her as more than just the woman who made his breakfast. "All right," he said. "Stay close. If you lose sight of me, stop moving and call out. I'll find you." They searched for 20 minutes that felt like hours. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the wind stole the heat from exposed skin in seconds. Iris's face went numb. Her hands, even in gloves, ached with cold. She followed Theron's back, a dark shape barely visible through the white. Then Theron stopped. There. A cow had gotten itself stuck in a wash, one leg wedged between rocks, hidden by snow. It was bellowing, terrified, and in pain. Theron knelt beside it, examining the leg by lantern light. "Not broken," he said. "Just stuck. Help me dig around the rocks." They dug with their hands, scooping snow away, pulling at frozen earth. Iris's fingers screamed with cold. She kept digging. After what felt like an eternity, the rocks shifted enough that Theron could lever the cow's leg free. It scrambled up limping but mobile, and he guided it back toward the barn. Inside the cabin afterward, Iris's hands were white and numb. Theron took them in his own, rubbing them gently to restore circulation. His hands were warm rough with calluses and surprisingly gentle. "You did good out there," he said. "Most women would have stayed inside." "Most women didn't agree to be ranch partners." "No," he said quietly. "I suppose they didn't." He released her hands, poured more coffee and whiskey, and they sat by the fire until warmth returned to their bones. December progressed, and with it a subtle change in the dynamic between them. Not friendship exactly. Something more hesitant than that, more cautious. But they spoke more, small exchanges while working, brief conversations over meals. Iris learned that Theron had served in the cavalry years ago, and that he never spoke about what he had done or seen. She learned that he could fix almost anything, that his hands were as skilled with broken machinery as they were with injured animals. She learned that he was patient in ways that surprised her, willing to show her things 2 or 3 times without irritation when she did not understand immediately. And Theron learned about her as well, though she was more careful with her words. Learned that she could read and cipher better than most men he knew, that she had a dry sense of humor that appeared unexpectedly, usually when he said something she found particularly ridiculous, that she worked harder than any hired hand he'd ever employed and never once complained about the cold or the labor or the loneliness of the place. On the 15th of December, Theron announced they needed to go to town for supplies before the serious winter storms made the trip impossible. They rode together on Gunner as they had that first day, but this time the silence between them was more comfortable. Iris had grown accustomed to the rhythm of riding behind him, and he had grown accustomed to the weight of another person depending on him to get somewhere safely. In Virginia City, Theron bought flour, coffee, sugar, salt, and other staples that would see them through January and February. While he was negotiating prices with the mercantile owner, a woman approached Iris. "You're Theron Ash's new wife," the woman said. It was not a question. "Yes," Iris said. "I'm Margaret Hale. My husband, Garrick, is Theron's nearest neighbor. Well, 8 miles is nearest out here." She was perhaps 50, with kind eyes and the weathered face of someone who had lived her entire life in hard country. "How are you settling in?" "Well enough," Iris said carefully. "Theron's a good man, quiet but good. He had a hard time after Anna and Lucas. We all thought he'd sell the ranch and leave, but he stayed. Held on when most men would have let go." She paused. "I'm glad he's not alone anymore. If you need anything, a woman to talk to, or help with anything, you come find us. Garrick can show you the way." "Thank you," Iris said, surprised by the kindness. "We take care of our own out here," Margaret said, "and you're one of us now." On the ride home, Iris asked Theron about the Hales. He told her what he knew. That Garrick had been the one to suggest the mail-order bride arrangement. That Margaret made the best bread in the county and sometimes left loaves on Theron's porch with no note, knowing he would not ask for help directly. That they had lost their own daughter to cholera 10 years ago and had never been quite the same after. "Everyone out here is carrying something," Theron said. "Loss mostly. The land takes and takes. You either learn to carry what it gives you, or you leave. And you stayed. I made a promise to Anna that I'd hold the land for our children's children, even though there won't be any now." He paused. "That probably sounds foolish to you." "No," Iris said. "It sounds like the kind of promise worth keeping." They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was the kind of silence that felt less like absence and more like understanding. Christmas came without ceremony. Theron did not acknowledge the day, except to mention while eating breakfast that it was December 25th. Iris had baked bread the night before and made it into a special dinner, roasted chicken and potatoes more elaborate than their usual meals. She did not explain why, and he did not ask, but he ate 3 helpings and said it was good. After dinner, she gave him a gift. A new shirt she had sewn from fabric she had brought from Boston, one of the few nice pieces she had salvaged from her old life. She had worked on it late at night by lamplight for 2 weeks. Theron held the shirt like he did not know what to do with it. "You didn't need to do this." "I wanted to. Call it payment for teaching me how to work a storm." He tried it on. It fit well, and for a moment something like pleasure crossed his face. Then he disappeared into his room and returned with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I wasn't sure," he said, "but Margaret Hale said I should." Inside the package was a pair of leather gloves lined with wool, good quality, expensive, the kind of gloves that would keep hands warm even in the worst cold. "Your hands were nearly frostbit that night we dug out the cow," he said. "Can't have my partner losing fingers." Iris put them on. "They fit perfectly." "Thank you, Theron." "You're welcome, Iris." It was the first time they had used each other's names directly, and something about it felt significant, like they had crossed an invisible line from strangers sharing space to something else. Not quite friends, but not quite strangers anymore either. The week after Christmas brought the coldest temperatures Iris had ever experienced. The kind of cold that made the wood in the cabin walls crack and pop, the kind of cold that froze water solid in minutes. Theron spent entire days breaking ice so the cattle could drink, coming inside only long enough to warm his hands by the fire before going back out. On one of these days, Iris made a decision. She put on her warmest clothes, including the new gloves, and went out to help him. Theron looked up from the water trough he was attacking with an axe, surprise, and something like concern on his face. "You don't need to be out here. I know, but you're going to work yourself into exhaustion, and then who'll break the ice tomorrow?" He considered this. "You know how to use an axe. I'm about to learn." He taught her how to stand, how to swing, how to let the weight of the axe head do most of the work. Iris's first swings were clumsy, barely chipping the ice, but she kept at it, and after an hour she had cleared 1 trough while Theron cleared 3. "You're learning," he said, and there was approval in his voice. They worked together for the rest of the day. By evening, Iris's arms ached. Her back was screaming, and she was fairly certain she had blisters on her blisters. But she had also learned something valuable. She had learned what it felt like to work beside someone who did not diminish your effort or condescend to your learning. Theron treated her like a partner, not a woman playing at ranch work. He corrected her when she did something wrong, praised her when she did something right, and otherwise let her figure things out at her own pace. That night after dinner, Iris was mending a tear in her dress when she became aware that Theron was watching her from his chair by the fire, not staring, just looking the way someone looks at something they are trying to understand. "What?" she asked. "You're different than I expected." "How so?" "Stronger. Not in body, though you're learning that too. Stronger in the way that matters." Anna was strong too, but in a different way. She was sunshine, made everything lighter just by being in the room. You're more like the stones at the bottom of a river, steady, unmovable, the kind of strength that doesn't show until everything else is worn away. Iris did not know what to say to that. It was the longest speech Theron had made about anything that was not directly related to ranch work, and it felt important in a way she could not quite name. "I had to be," she said finally. "Strong, I mean. When Henry died and left me with his debts, I had two choices. Be strong or break. I chose not to break." "What was he like, your husband?" "Charming, when he wanted to be. He could convince anyone of anything. That's how he got into debt. He convinced himself he could always win the next hand, make the next score. And I loved him in the beginning. But love doesn't pay debts. Love doesn't keep you warm when the creditors come. Eventually I learned that. He never did." "Do you miss him?" "I miss who I thought he was. I don't miss who he actually was." Theron nodded like this made sense to him. "Anna was everything good, everything I wasn't, patient and kind and able to see beauty in things I just saw as dirt and work. When she died, the world got darker. It's still dark, but lately it's less dark than it was. Because of me. Because of someone else being here, because the cabin doesn't feel like a tomb anymore." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them, two people who had married for practical reasons, slowly discovering that practicality and partnership might be the foundation of something more. On the last day of December, a storm came that made all the previous storms look like practice. The wind howled like something alive and furious. Snow fell so thick that standing outside was like being inside a white cloud that stole your breath and sense of direction. The temperature dropped so low that Theron said water would freeze before it hit the ground if you poured it from a bucket. They went out every 3 hours through the night, counting cattle breaking ice, making sure no animals were stuck or injured. By dawn they were both exhausted, but all the stock was accounted for and safe. As the sun rose weak and pale through the storm, they stood in the barn warming themselves before heading back to the cabin. Iris's hair had come loose from its pins, hanging in frozen strands around her face. Theron's beard was crusted with ice. They looked like two survivors of some great battle, which in a way they were. "You kept up," Theron said. "All night you kept up. I didn't have to slow down for you or double back to check on you. You just kept up." "I told you I would." "People tell me things all the time. Usually they're lying or they're wrong. You weren't either." He reached out and brushed a strand of frozen hair away from her face. It was the first time he had touched her since that night he had warmed her frozen hands, and the gesture was so gentle, so unexpected, that Iris forgot to breathe for a moment. Then he dropped his hand and turned away. "We should get inside, get warm." But something had changed. They both felt it, even if neither said anything about it. The careful distance they had maintained, the professional partnership they had cultivated, had developed a crack. And through that crack, something else was beginning to show. In the cabin, Iris made coffee and eggs, though her hands shook with exhaustion. Theron sat at the table watching her move around the kitchen with an expression she could not quite read. When she set the plate in front of him, he caught her hand, not forcefully, just a light touch barely there. "Iris." She looked down at him. "Yes, thank you, for staying out there with me, for not quitting when it got hard, for being the kind of partner I didn't know I needed." "You're welcome, Theron." He released her hand and they ate their breakfast as the storm continued to rage outside, two people learning that sometimes the strongest bonds are forged not in moments of joy, but in the grinding, relentless work of survival. January would bring new challenges, and with it, the complications that would test everything they had begun to build. But for now, on this last day of December, they had made it through the hardest month together. And that, Iris thought, as she watched Theron finish his coffee, that was no small thing. January came to Montana with a silence that felt almost malicious in its completeness. The kind of silence that happened when the temperature dropped so low that even the wind stopped moving, as if the air itself had frozen solid. Theron had warned Iris about this, about the deep cold that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground, that made metal burn skin on contact, that killed exposed flesh in minutes. But knowing something and experiencing it were different things entirely. On the morning of January 3rd, Iris woke to find frost patterns on the inside of her window, delicate as lace and just as fragile. The water in the basin by her bed had frozen solid overnight despite the fire burning in the main room. When she dressed, her fingers were clumsy with cold and her breath came out in white clouds that hung in the air. In the main room, Theron was already stoking the fire, feeding it logs until it roared hot enough to push back against the cold that pressed against every wall. He glanced up at her entrance. 20 below, he said. Maybe colder. We'll need to keep the stock close today and check them every 2 hours. In cold like this, they can freeze standing up if they're not moving. They worked through that day and the next and the day after that in a routine that had become almost automatic. Check the cattle, break ice, haul water, split wood, feed the fire, check the cattle again. The world had contracted to just these tasks repeated endlessly because stopping meant death for the animals and possibly for them too. On the fourth day, something happened that Iris would remember for the rest of her life. They were in the barn checking a heifer that had seemed lethargic the day before. Theron was examining the animal's hooves for signs of frostbite when Iris noticed something on a shelf in the corner. A small wooden horse carved with obvious care, smooth from years of handling. Next to it, a child's book, the cover worn soft. She must have made some sound because Theron looked up and followed her gaze. His face, already tight from the cold, went rigid. That was Lucas's, he said. His voice had gone flat, empty of inflection. I kept meaning to move those, never did. Iris picked up the wooden horse carefully, turning it in her hands. The craftsmanship was beautiful, simple but elegant, every line purposeful. You made this. I made a lot of things for him. Seemed important at the time. Now they're just wood. No, Iris said quietly. They're more than wood. They're proof that he was loved. Theron stood abruptly. I need to check the north fence. And he was gone out into the brutal cold, leaving Iris alone in the barn with a toy horse and the ghost of a boy she would never meet. She set the horse back on the shelf exactly where it had been and followed Theron outside. She found him at the fence line, staring out at the white expanse of land, his face raw from wind and something else. I'm sorry, she said. I shouldn't have touched his things. It's not that. His voice was rough. It's that I've spent 3 years trying not to think about him, not to remember, because remembering hurts worse than the cold or the work or the loneliness. And then you pick up something he touched, and suddenly he's real again, and I can't breathe because I want him back so much it's like dying. Iris stood beside him, not touching, just present. My husband wasn't a good man, but in the weeks after he died, I would still wake up expecting to hear him in the next room. Would set out 2 cups for coffee before remembering there was only me. Grief doesn't ask permission. It just takes up residence and refuses to leave. How long before it stops? I don't know that it does. I think we just get stronger at carrying it. They stood together in the killing cold, 2 people who had lost everything that mattered and were learning slowly and painfully how to build something from what remained. That night after dinner, Theron did something he had not done since Iris arrived. He opened the drawer where he kept Anna's and Lucas's photograph and brought it to the table where Iris was mending a shirt by lamplight. "This was them," he said, setting the photograph down. Iris looked at the image. A woman with soft eyes and a gentle smile, her hand resting on the shoulder of a boy who had his father's serious expression but his mother's kindness in his face. They looked happy. They looked like people who believed their happiness would last. "She was beautiful," Iris said, "and he looks like you." He had her heart, though, thank God. He was gentle with animals, gentle with everything. Used to cry when we had to butcher a chicken. I worried he was too soft for this life. Theron's voice cracked. Turns out he didn't need to be hard. He just needed to live long enough to grow up. "Tell me about him, if it doesn't hurt too much." So Theron did. Told her about how Lucas had been afraid of the dark until he was 6, how Theron had carved that wooden horse to give him something to hold on to at night. Told her about how the boy had loved watching the cattle, had given them all names, despite Theron explaining they were livestock, not pets. Told her about the morning Lucas had announced he wanted to be a rancher like his father, and how that had made Theron prouder than anything else in his life. And Iris listened and did not try to fix his pain or diminish it with platitudes. She just listened, and sometimes that was the greatest kindness one person could offer another. When Theron finished, he carefully returned the photograph to its drawer. "I haven't talked about them to anyone, not even Garrick. Thank you for listening. Thank you for trusting me enough to tell me." They returned to their evening routines, but something had shifted. The wall Theron had built around his grief had developed a door, and he had opened it just slightly, just enough to let Iris see inside. 2 weeks into January, Garrick Hale rode up to the ranch on a clear morning when the sun was bright enough to hurt the eyes, but provided no warmth at all. Theron was in the barn, and Iris was in the cabin kneading bread dough when she heard the horse approach. She wiped her hands and went to the door. Garrick was dismounting a man in his middle 50s with a weathered face and the careful movements of someone whose body had been used hard for decades. He touched his hat brim when he saw her. "Mrs. Ash? I'm Garrick Hale. Met my wife Margaret in town last month." "I remember. Please come inside. It's too cold to stand out here." In the cabin she poured him coffee while he warmed his hands by the fire. Theron came in a moment later, surprise and something like pleasure crossing his face at seeing his friend. "Garrick, what brings you out in this cold? Checking on you. And I wanted to meet your wife proper-like." He smiled at Iris. "Margaret sent bread. She figured you two have been snowed in long enough to appreciate something you didn't have to make yourself." "Please thank her," Iris said. "That's very kind." The three of them sat around the table, and Garrick caught Theron up on news from the surrounding ranches, who had lost stock to the cold, who had decided to sell out and move back east, who was barely hanging on. It was the kind of conversation that happened among men who understood that ranching was less a profession and more a form of controlled catastrophe where success was measured not in profit, but in survival. After a while, Garrick turned to Iris. "How are you finding Montana, Mrs. Ash?" "Cold," she said honestly, "and harder than anything I've done before, but I'm managing. Theron treating you well. He's treating me fair, which is all I asked for." Garrick nodded approvingly. "Fair is better than most can hope for out here." He looked at Theron. "You look better than you did last time I saw you, less like a man determined to work himself to death." "Having help makes a difference. Having a partner makes a difference," Garrick corrected. "There's a distinction." He finished his coffee and stood. "I should get back before Margaret worries. But before I go, I want to invite you both to dinner. 2 weeks from Saturday. Margaret would enjoy the company, and frankly, so would I. Winter gets long when you're talking to the same person every day, and that person is yourself." Theron looked at Iris, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly. "We'd be honored," Theron said. After Garrick left, Iris returned to her bread dough and Theron to his paperwork. But there was a new ease in the cabin, a sense that they were not quite as alone as they had been, that there were people nearby by Montana standards who cared whether they lived or died, and who would notice if they disappeared. Late January brought a break in the cold. The temperature rose to merely freezing instead of dangerously below, and the world seemed to exhale after holding its breath for weeks. Theron used the opportunity to teach Iris how to shoot. They went out to a flat area behind the barn where Theron set up targets, pieces of wood propped against hay bales. He handed her his Winchester rifle, showing her how to hold it, where to place her hands, how to sight down the barrel. "The first time I fired a rifle, the recoil nearly knocked me over," Iris said. "Plant your feet wider, lean into it. The gun's going to kick, but if you're ready for it, it won't move you." He stood behind her, adjusting her stance, and Iris was acutely aware of his proximity, of his hands on her shoulders positioning her, of his voice near her ear, low and instructive, of the warmth of him in the cold air. "Breathe," he said. "Slow and steady. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." She fired. The rifle kicked against her shoulder hard enough to bruise, but she stayed upright. The bullet hit the hay bale, missing the wood target by 2 feet. "Again," Theron said. They practiced for an hour. By the end, Iris was hitting the target more often than she was missing it, and her shoulder was going to be colorful with bruises tomorrow, but she felt something she had not felt in years, competent, capable, like a woman who could protect herself if she needed to. "Why did you want to teach me this?" she asked as they walked back to the cabin. "Because I might not always be here," Theron said. "Could get hurt, could get caught in a storm. Hell, could die tomorrow from 100 different things. And if something happens to me, you need to be able to protect yourself and the ranch until you can get help." That's grimly practical. That's Montana. But Iris understood what he was really saying, that he was investing in her survival, that he was thinking about her future, even if that future might not include him. That despite their arrangement being based on practical necessity, he cared enough to make sure she would be all right. The dinner at the Hales Ranch 2 weeks later was both strange and wonderful. Strange because Iris had not sat at a table with more than one other person in months. Wonderful because Margaret Hale was warm and funny, and treated Iris like a friend rather than a curiosity. Over roasted pork and potatoes and vegetables that Margaret had canned last fall, they talked about everything and nothing. About the winter, about the spring that would eventually come, about the small triumphs and large frustrations of ranch life. At one point, while Theron and Garrick were discussing cattle prices, Margaret leaned close to Iris. "He looks happy," she said quietly, "or at least less miserable than he's looked in 3 years. That's your doing." "I'm just his employee," Iris said. "Honey, that man doesn't look at his employee the way he looks at you, and you don't look at your employer the way you look at him." Iris felt heat rise to her face. "It's not like that between us." "Maybe not yet," Margaret said with a knowing smile, "but give it time." On the ride home with Iris seated behind Theron on Gunner, she thought about Margaret's words, about the way Theron had smiled tonight more than she had seen him smile in all the weeks she had known him, about the way he had introduced her to the Hales, not as his hired help, but as his wife, with something like pride in his voice, about the way her heart had started doing strange things whenever he stood too close or spoke too gently. This was not part of their arrangement. This was dangerous territory, where feelings could complicate what had been simple, and hurt could enter where there had been only professional courtesy. She needed to be more careful. But that night, as she lay in her narrow bed listening to the wind, she acknowledged a truth she had been avoiding. She was beginning to care for Theron Ash, not just as an employer or even a partner, but as a man, a good man, a man who had been broken by loss and had put himself back together through sheer stubborn will, a man who treated her with respect and patience and a quiet kindness that made her chest ache. And that was a problem, because their arrangement had an end date. 45 months, and then she would be free of her debt and free to choose her own path. She could not afford to fall in love with a man she might have to leave. Could not afford it, and yet she suspected it might already be too late. The last week of January brought a letter. Theron retrieved it from the postal box in town, along with the monthly supplies, and handed it to Iris without comment. The envelope was cream-colored expensive paper, with her name written in an elegant hand she did not recognize. She opened it in the privacy of her room. Inside was a single page, and the words made her blood run cold. "Mrs. Caldwell, we have been informed you are residing in the Montana Territory. Mr. Abner Locke, to whom you owe the sum of $670, has engaged my services to collect this debt. Montana law requires that you either pay in full or return to Boston to make arrangements for payment through service. You have 60 days to comply before legal action is taken. I will arrive in Virginia City on March 15th to discuss this matter. Respectfully, Sterling Webb, Attorney at Law." Iris read the letter 3 times, and with each reading, her chest grew tighter. She had known this was coming, had known that her creditors would eventually find her. But she had hoped for more time, hoped that somehow, miraculously, the debt would disappear or be forgotten. But debts never disappeared, and creditors never forgot. She sat on her bed, the letter in her hands, and tried to calculate. She had been here 3 months, had earned $45. That left $625 still owed. Even if she could convince them to accept monthly payments, even if Theron agreed to continue the arrangement, it would take 3.5 more years to pay it off, 3.5 more years of being bound to this debt, of not being free. Unless she returned to Boston, unless she accepted whatever arrangement Locke wanted to make, which, based on his reputation, would be working in one of his factories for pennies a day until the debt was paid, which would take even longer than staying here. Or worse, accepting his other offer, the one she had fled Boston to escape. She could not go back, would not go back, which meant she needed to find another solution, and she had 60 days to do it. That night she told Theron about the letter. They sat at the table after dinner, the letter between them, and she watched his face as he read it, watched his expression go from calm to concerned to something that looked almost like anger. "He can't make you go back," Theron said. "Not legally. You're a resident of Montana now. But the debt is legal, and if I don't pay, they can take legal action, garnish wages, put a lien on property, and I have no property, which means they'll pursue other remedies." "Like what?" "Like forcing me into indentured servitude. It's legal in some states for debt collection. I don't know if Montana allows it, but I don't want to find out." Theron was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. "How much have you paid off?" $45? 3 months at $15 per month. "So you owe $625 still?" "Yes." He stood and walked to the fireplace, staring into the flames. Iris watched him, tension coiling in her stomach. She knew what she was about to say, knew she had no right to ask it, but she was desperate, and desperation made people do things they otherwise would not. "Theron, I know this isn't your problem. I know our arrangement was for 45 months, and I have no right to ask for anything more than what we agreed. But I need to know if there's any way I could work off the debt faster. Extra work, something I could sell, anything that would allow me to pay more each month." He turned to look at her. "You already work dawn to dark. There isn't more work to do." "Then I don't know what to do." Her voice cracked despite her attempt to keep it steady. "I don't want to go back to Boston. I don't want to spend the rest of my life paying off my dead husband's gambling debts, but I don't see another choice." Theron crossed the room and sat down across from her. "There is another choice. We make this marriage real. Legally, if you're married, your husband's debts from before the marriage don't transfer. And in Montana, a woman's property and wages belong to her if the marriage is established before debt collection is pursued. But we'd need to prove the marriage is real, not just a contract on paper." Iris stared at him. "You want to make our marriage real to protect me from debt collectors. I want to protect you because you're my partner. Because you've worked harder than anyone I've ever hired and complained less. Because you make my coffee the way I like it, and you learned to break ice and check cattle in blizzards, and you didn't quit when things got hard. Because this ranch runs better with you here, and I don't want to lose that. But that's not the same as wanting a real marriage. His eyes met hers, and there was something in them she had not seen before. Something vulnerable and honest and a little frightened. Maybe it's not, but maybe it's enough. Maybe partnership and respect and trust are better foundations than romance anyway. And what would a real marriage mean for us? It would mean you stay, not just until the debt is paid, but permanently if you want. It would mean we build this ranch together as partners. It would mean sharing a life, not just a house. And what about love? The question came out smaller than she intended. I loved once, Theron said quietly. Loved with everything I had. And when I lost them, it nearly destroyed me. I don't know if I can love like that again. But I can offer you something real, something solid. Partnership, respect, a home, safety. Maybe that's enough. Iris looked at him, this man who had been a stranger 4 months ago and had become someone essential to her daily existence, who had taught her to shoot and to work cattle and to survive in a place that killed the unprepared, who had shown her his grief and trusted her with his memories, who was offering her a life based not on passion, but on something steadier and possibly more lasting. I need time to think, she said. Take the time you need. But Sterling Webb arrives in 6 weeks. If we're going to do this, we need to establish the marriage as real before then. She nodded and retreated to her room, where she lay awake for hours, thinking about choices and consequences, about what she was willing to give up and what she was willing to fight for. By morning, she had made her decision. She found Theron in the barn, mucking out stalls. I'll do it, she said. I'll make this a real marriage, but I need you to know something. He leaned on his pitchfork, waiting. I'm not doing this just to escape debt. I'm doing it because in 4 months, you've shown me more respect and kindness than my first husband did in 5 years of marriage. You've given me purpose and taught me skills and treated me like someone worth teaching. You've shared your grief and your home and your life. And if we're going to do this, if we're going to make this real, then I need you to know that I'm choosing you. Not just choosing to stay, but choosing you specifically. Something shifted in his expression, softened. I'm choosing you too, Iris. Maybe I didn't know that's what I was doing when I sent for a mail-order bride. But somewhere between teaching you to shoot and watching you dig out a cow in a blizzard and listening to you read books by the fire, I started choosing you. They stood in the barn surrounded by the smell of hay and animals and honest work and made a choice that would change both their lives. Not a choice born of passion or romance, but a choice built on partnership and respect and the slow, steady building of trust that happens when 2 people work side by side toward a common goal. It was not the kind of love story people wrote songs about, but it was real. And sometimes real was better than romantic. Sometimes real was exactly what 2 broken people needed to become whole again. The decision once made changed everything and nothing. They still woke at 4:30, still worked from dawn until dark, still sat at opposite ends of the table for meals. But now there was intention behind it. Now when Theron's hand brushed Iris's as he passed her the coffee pot, they both noticed. Now when she mended his shirts, she took extra care with the stitching, and he took extra care not to tear them. February came cold but clear, and they began the small adjustments that would make their claim believable when Sterling Webb arrived. Iris moved some of her belongings into Theron's room. Not everything, not yet, but enough. A hairbrush on the dresser, a shawl draped over the chair, the kind of details that suggested a wife who shared her husband's space. They practiced being married in ways that felt both natural and strange. Theron began sitting closer to her at the table, not at the opposite end, but near enough that their knees sometimes touched. Iris began touching his shoulder when she poured his coffee, a casual gesture that a wife might make. Small things. Deliberate things. We need witnesses, Theron said one evening in mid-February. People who can testify that this is a real marriage, not a legal convenience. The Hales, Iris said. Garrick and Margaret, yes. And maybe Tom Henderson, the mercantile owner. He's seen us in town together, and Sarah Mills, the postmistress. She's sharp. If she believes it's real, Webb will have a harder time arguing otherwise. They rode to the Hales Ranch on a Sunday afternoon when the weather allowed. Garrick and Margaret listened as Theron explained the situation, the debt the lawyer, the need to prove the marriage legitimate. "Of course we'll testify," Margaret said immediately. "Anyone with eyes can see you two belong together." Iris felt her face warm. "We've only been married 4 months. Honey, I've seen couples married 40 years with less connection than you two have." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed Iris's hand. "You're good for him, and he's good for you." "That's all that matters." Garrick nodded his agreement. "We'll be there, and I'll bring Tom Henderson and his wife if you need more witnesses. Webb won't know what hit him." The night of February 28th, a week before Webb's scheduled arrival, Theron stood in the doorway of his bedroom, looking at Iris, who sat mending by the fire as she did every evening. "We should talk about sleeping arrangements," he said quietly. Iris set down her mending. "All right. If Webb investigates, he might ask people in town about us, about whether we share a room, whether we—" He stopped, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Whether we sleep together," Iris finished for him. "Yes. And do you think we need to make it convincing?" Theron was quiet for a long moment. "I think we need to share a room. What happens in that room is between us, but the appearance needs to be right." That night, Iris moved her remaining belongings into Theron's bedroom. They lay on opposite sides of the bed, a careful distance between them, both fully clothed on top of the covers. The darkness was complete, broken only by the faint glow of embers from the fireplace in the main room. "Theron," Iris's voice was soft in the dark. "Yes. Thank you for doing this, for protecting me." "You don't need to thank me. We're partners. That's what partners do." They fell asleep that way, separate but together, and when Iris woke in the pre-dawn darkness, she found that sometime in the night they had moved closer. Not touching, but near enough that she could hear his breathing, feel the warmth of him beside her. It was not the marriage she had imagined as a young girl, but it was real, and it was theirs. March 15th arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if spring had decided to make an early appearance. The snow was melting, turning the roads to mud, and the creek was running high with runoff. Theron and Iris rode to Virginia City together, arriving at the town hall at 10 in the morning. Sterling Webb was waiting. He was younger than Iris had expected, perhaps 35, with the polished look of a Boston lawyer who had never done a day of physical labor in his life. He stood when they entered, his expression professional and cold. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said. "Mrs. Ashe," Iris corrected, her voice steady. "Of course. My apologies." He did not sound apologetic. "Shall we begin?" The meeting took place in a small room in the town hall, with Judge Morrison presiding. The judge was a fair man, known for following the letter of the law, but not being swayed by fancy talk. Garrick and Margaret Hale sat in the back of the room, along with Tom Henderson and Sarah Mills from the post office. Webb presented his case with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter of debt collection. Mrs. Caldwell owes Mr. Abner Locke the sum of $670, a debt incurred by her late husband, but one she acknowledged and agreed to repay. She has fled to Montana to avoid this obligation and has entered into a marriage of convenience to circumvent her legal responsibilities." "That's not true," Iris said, but Theron touched her hand gently, silencing her. Judge Morrison looked at Webb. "You have proof this marriage is not legitimate. The timing suggests as much, Your Honor. Mrs. Caldwell arrived in Montana in November. She married Mr. Ashe immediately. And now, when faced with debt collection, she claims the protection of Montana law, which states a wife cannot be held responsible for her husband's debts if the marriage predates the debt. But this debt predates this marriage." "The debt was her first husband's," Theron said, speaking for the first time. "Not hers. And not mine. And our marriage is legitimate under Montana law. Can you prove that Mr. Ash?" the judge asked. "Yes, sir. We have witnesses." Garrick Hale was called first. He testified that he had known Theron for 15 years, that he had suggested the mail-order bride arrangement, and that he had watched Theron and Iris's relationship develop over 4 months. "What makes you believe this is a real marriage?" Webb asked, his tone skeptical. "The way they look at each other," Garrick said simply. "The way they work together. The way Theron talks about her when she's not around. I was married for 30 years before my first wife died. I know what a real marriage looks like. This is one." Margaret Hale testified next, describing the dinner they had shared in late January, the small intimacies she had observed between Theron and Iris, the way they moved around each other like two people who had learned each other's rhythms. Tom Henderson, the mercantile owner, testified that he had seen them in town together multiple times, that they purchased supplies, like a family preparing for a future together, not like two strangers sharing a roof. Finally, Theron was called to testify. "Mr. Ash," Judge Morrison said, "tell me about your marriage." Theron spoke slowly, carefully, but with conviction. "I married Iris because I needed help on the ranch. That's true. But somewhere in the last 4 months, it became more than that. She learned to work cattle in blizzards. She learned to break ice and split wood and shoot a rifle. She never once complained when the work was hard or the cold was brutal. She asked about my wife and son, the ones I lost, and she listened when I needed to talk about them. She made my house feel like a home again." He paused, looking at Iris. "I don't know if what we have is love in the way people write about in books, but I know I wake up every morning grateful she's here. I know I work harder because I want to build something with her, not just for myself. I know that when she's out of my sight, I worry about her, and I know that if she left tomorrow, it would break something in me that I don't think I could fix." The room was silent when he finished. Judge Morrison turned to Iris. "Mrs. Ash, do you have anything to add?" Iris stood. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was clear. "When I came to Montana, I was running. From debt, from a life that had broken me, from a future that looked like nothing but more of the same. Theron offered me a practical arrangement, and I took it because I was desperate. But I stayed because of who he is, because he treats me like an equal, because he's patient and kind and stronger than anyone I've ever known. Because when I look at the rest of my life, I can't imagine spending it anywhere but here with him." She looked at Webb. "You can take the money I've earned, all $45. You can pursue the debt through every legal channel available, but you cannot make me go back to Boston, and you cannot make me leave this marriage, because I choose it. I choose him, every single day." Judge Morrison was quiet for a long moment, reviewing the papers in front of him. Finally, he spoke. "Mr. Webb, I've heard your case and I've heard the testimony of these witnesses. Montana law is clear. A wife cannot be held responsible for debts incurred by a previous husband if she has remarried in good faith. The testimony I've heard today convinces me that this marriage is legitimate, not a legal fiction designed to avoid debt." He looked at Iris. "Mrs. Ash, you are not responsible for your late husband's gambling debts. Mr. Locke may pursue collection through your late husband's estate, if any exists, but he has no claim on you or your earnings." Webb stood abruptly. "Your Honor, I must object. Your objection is noted and overruled. This matter is closed." Webb gathered his papers with sharp, angry movements and left without another word. The room seemed to exhale collectively. Outside the town hall in the warm March sunshine, Garrick clapped Theron on the shoulder. "Well done, both of you." "Thank you," Theron said, "for everything." "That's what neighbors do," Garrick said. "Now get your wife home. You've got a ranch to run." On the ride back, Iris was quiet for a long time. Finally she said, "Did you mean it?" "What you said in there, every word," Theron replied. "Did you? Every word." They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence. Two people who had started as strangers become partners and were slowly, carefully becoming something more. Spring had come late to Montana that year, but when it arrived, it came with a violence of green that transformed the brown grasslands into something that looked almost gentle. The creek ran high and clear, the cattle grew fat on new grass, and the garden behind the cabin erupted with the vegetables Iris had planted in April. 15 months had passed since Iris had stepped off the train in Virginia City. 15 months since she had agreed to a practical arrangement with a stranger. 15 months since she had learned what Montana winters meant and what it felt like to work beside someone who saw you as an equal. The ranch had changed in those months. They had hired a young man named Peter to help with the heavy work, a quiet boy from town who was good with horses and asked few questions. The herd had grown to 95 head. They had repaired the barn roof and built a new chicken coop and cleared the irrigation channels that would water the garden through summer. But the biggest change was in the people. Theron still woke at 4:30, but now Iris woke with him, and they started their days together with coffee and quiet conversation before the work began. They still worked from dawn until dark, but now they worked side by side more often, and the work felt less like survival and more like building something that would last. And 3 weeks ago, Iris had told Theron that she was pregnant. He had been in the barn mending a broken harness when she came to him with the news. She had been nervous, unsure how he would react, afraid that the memory of Lucas might make this new child feel like a betrayal. But Theron had simply pulled her close and held her for a long time, his face buried in her hair, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I thought I'd never have this again," he had said. "A family, a future. I thought that part of my life was over." "Are you happy?" she had asked. "I'm terrified," he had admitted. "But yes, I'm happy." Now, on a warm June evening, they sat together on the porch of the cabin watching the sun set over the western mountains. Iris's hand rested on the small swell of her belly, not obvious yet, but present. Theron's arm was around her shoulders. "Do you ever think about Boston?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said, "but not often, and never with regret." "What do you think about the future? What we're building here? What kind of life our child will have?" Theron was quiet for a moment. "I opened the cabin, Anna and Lucas's cabin." Iris turned to look at him, surprised. "When, last week, while you were in town with Margaret, I packed up Lucas's toys, his books, Anna's things. I'm not forgetting them. I put their photograph on the mantel in the main room where it belongs. But I can't keep that cabin locked forever like a shrine. It's not what they would have wanted." "What will you do with it?" "I thought maybe when the baby comes and gets older, it could be a playroom or storage or whatever we need it to be. Not a tomb anymore, just a building." Iris leaned her head against his shoulder. "That's good. That's healing." "You did that," he said quietly. "You healed me. I didn't think it was possible, but you did." "We healed each other," she corrected. They sat in silence as the sun dropped below the mountains and the sky turned from gold to purple to deep blue. Stars began to appear, first one, then dozens, then thousands. More stars than Iris had ever seen in Boston, where the city lights drowned them out. "Iris," Theron said. "Yes, I love you. I don't know if I've said that out loud before, but I do. I love you." She turned to face him in the growing darkness. "I love you too. I think I have for a while now. I was just afraid to say it." He kissed her, then gentle and sure. And when they finally pulled apart, Iris thought about how strange life was, how the worst thing that had ever happened to her, Henry's death, and the debt it left behind, had led her to the best thing, how running away had brought her home. "Come inside," Theron said, standing and offering his hand. "It's getting cold." She took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. Together they walked into the cabin where a fire was burning low in the hearth, and the table was set for two, and the smell of bread baking filled the air. Outside, the Montana night settled over the ranch like a blessing. The cattle were safe. The land was theirs. And inside the cabin, two people who had been broken by loss had found a way to be whole again together. The year was 1881, and in the Montana Territory a man could still measure his worth in the land he owned and the cattle he raised. But Theron Ash had learned that true worth was measured in different ways. In the woman who stood beside him, in the child they would raise together, in the choice to love again, even when love had once destroyed him. In the morning he would wake at 4:30 and begin another day of hard work. But tonight he would sleep beside his wife, his hand resting on the curve of her belly where their child grew, and he would be grateful for every choice that had led him to this moment. Some love stories begin with passion. This one had begun with partnership, but it had become something deeper, something lasting, something real. And that Theron thought as he held Iris close in the darkness was worth more than all the gold in Montana.